Think about the shows you grew up with, the cartoons that were on every Saturday morning, the theme songs you can still sing word for word. Now imagine some of those exact episodes were quietly pulled off the air, and a few erased so completely that people weren't even sure they were real. One sent nearly 700 kids to the hospital in a single night. A Disney movie had 3.5 million copies recalled over 2 frames nobody was supposed to notice. And near the bottom, there's a character a whole generation grew up loving, whose actor passed away in real life, and the show quietly chose never to explain to the kids why his character simply disappeared. This is the disturbing banned kids show episodes Iceberg. We start at the surface, with a few you already know, before going all the way down to ones nobody really wants to talk about. And honestly guys, the stuff near the bottom isn't about cartoons being too scary or too gross. It's about what was happening behind the camera. Quick heads up before we start, everything here comes from news reporting, public records, and archived broadcasts. And some of it gets heavy. None of it is being celebrated. This is a documentary about media history. Let's start at the top. Level 1. Electric Soldier Porygon. On December 16th, 1997, an episode of Pokémon aired one single time in Japan, and it never aired again anywhere on Earth. The episode sent the heroes inside a computer, and at one point there's a huge explosion rendered as rapidly flashing red and blue lights, strobing about 12 times a second across the whole screen. In homes all over Japan, kids watching that scene started having seizures. By the end of the night, more than 680 children had been taken to hospitals. The press called it Pokémon shock, and it's still in the record books as one of the largest photosensitive seizure incidents ever broadcast. But here's the part that almost never gets mentioned. The episode is named after Porygon, so Porygon gets treated as the villain of the whole story. But the flashing wasn't even Porygon's doing. That strobing explosion came from Pikachu using an electric attack on a missile. Porygon basically just stood there, and yet Porygon is the one that got punished for it. The little digital creature has never been the star of an episode again, not once in over 25 years, and the episode itself was wiped from rotation worldwide. So the one who actually set off the seizures is still the face of the whole franchise, while the show quietly retired the little guy who had nothing to do with any of it. One Beer. If you grew up on Tiny Toon Adventures, you probably never saw the segment called One Beer because Fox pulled it fast. The setup sounds harmless for about 10 seconds. Buster, Plucky, and Hampton find a single can of beer and decide to split it. Then the cartoon takes them from one sip to slurring, to stealing a police car, to driving off a cliff. And the show doesn't soften the landing. The 3 of them are shown as little angels drifting up from the wreck, which is the cartoon's way of staging it as if they don't make it. It was meant to be an over-the-top anti-drinking message, and you can argue it was trying to do a good thing. But even as a blunt anti-drinking warning, following 3 beloved characters all the way to that grim ending was a bit too much for a Saturday morning block, and the segment basically vanished from rotation for years. These days, you can find it again if you go looking, but for a long time, a lot of people who saw it as kids genuinely weren't sure if they'd imagined the whole thing. Mr. Skinny Legs. Let's bring the temperature down for a second with one that's almost funny, except it's also completely reasonable. There's a Peppa Pig episode called Mr. Skinny Legs, where Peppa is scared of a little spider, and Daddy Pig reassures her with a nice, gentle moral. Spiders are friendly, and they can't hurt you. It's a lovely message, and it's totally fine in England. In Australia, it's basically a public safety problem. Australia is home to some of the most venomous spiders on the planet. The kind where it can't hurt you is the opposite of the advice you want a toddler internalizing. So Australian broadcasters pulled the episode. And then, years later, after it quietly crept back onto the schedule, a parent complained and it got pulled in Australia a second time. Same cartoon, same friendly spider, harmless bedtime viewing in England, and a genuine safety worry in a country full of things that actually can hurt you. Sesame Street and the Wicked Witch. In February 1976, Sesame Street did something it almost never did. It tried to genuinely scare you. The show brought on Margaret Hamilton, reprising the exact role that traumatized an entire earlier generation. The Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz, in full green makeup. The idea was sweet on paper. The witch loses her broom on Sesame Street, gets a little help from the residents, and learns to be nicer. The kids would see that even something scary could be reasoned with. That's not how it landed. According to the show's own records, parents wrote in describing children who were frightened, who cried, who didn't want to watch Sesame Street anymore, which, for a preschool show, is pretty much the worst thing that can happen. The Children's Television Workshop tested it, saw how badly it scared young viewers, and made a decision. Episode 847 aired that one time on February 10th, 1976, and then it was shelved. For decades, it was almost a piece of lost media, talked about but never seen, until a copy finally surfaced for researchers in 2019. A show built entirely on making kids feel safe had accidentally proven it could do the opposite, and chose to never risk it again. Deadly Force. Disney's Gargoyles was always a darker, more grown-up cartoon than its time slot suggested, but one episode pushed past what Disney was willing to put in front of kids. In Deadly Force, one of the gargoyles, Broadway, is messing around with a real handgun he doesn't understand, treating it like a toy. The gun goes off, and the person it hits is Elisa, the show's human lead, who's then shown lying on the kitchen floor, seriously hurt. For a 1994 kids cartoon, an accidental on-screen shooting of a main character crossed a line for that time slot. The episode was pulled from rotation, and when it eventually came back years later, it came back censored, with the scene reframed and the blood scrubbed out. What makes it stick is that the episode was actually trying to teach gun safety. That's literally the lesson. But the show made the danger feel so real that the network decided kids shouldn't see the very thing the episode was warning them about. The uncut version is still out there, with the shooting left in, which is exactly the part Disney decided its youngest viewers shouldn't see. Level 2. The Lion and the Bear. Teletubbies was made for actual babies. It's about as gentle as television gets, so it's kinda strange that one of its segments got pulled in country after country for scaring children. The bit is called The Lion and the Bear, and if you watch it now, you'll immediately get why. The animation style suddenly shifts. The music drops into this low, uneasy drone, and a bear and then a lion appear and let out these deep, real-sounding roars. For a toddler whose whole experience of the show is giggling and cuddles, it apparently hit like a horror film. The complaints came in from everywhere. The original version got pulled from broadcast, or simply never aired at all, in a whole string of different countries, all over frightened little kids. And in the UK, instead of cutting it, the BBC quietly re-edited the whole thing in 2001. Softer music, giggling Teletubbies spliced in, a gentler ending. So it stopped feeling like a warning and started feeling like a cartoon again. So depending on which country you grew up in, and what year, you either saw the creepy original, the defanged remix, or nothing at all. Same gentle baby show, quietly split into 3 completely different versions of itself. Dad Baby. Bluey is probably the most beloved kids show on the planet right now. The kind of thing parents will tell you is secretly better than most shows for adults. And there's an episode of it that, for a long time, Americans simply couldn't watch. It's called Dad Baby, and the premise is that Bandit, the dad, straps the baby into one of those front-facing carriers and then acts out, in full slapstick cartoon dog fashion, going into labor and giving birth. In Australia, where the show is made, it aired with no issue at all. In America, Disney took one look at a dad pretending to give birth and decided it wasn't going on Disney+. For years, the only way US fans could see it was importing a DVD or finding the one official upload that snuck out on the show's own YouTube channel. There's nothing remotely dark in it. It's just a goofy bit about a baby carrier. But it tells you something about how nervous a company gets the second a kids show wanders near where babies come from. Even the gentlest show on earth has an episode somebody decided you couldn't handle. We Need to Talk. Here's one where the censorship wasn't about violence or anything scary at all. Steven Universe is a Cartoon Network show that became famous partly for how openly it told a love story between 2 characters who are both coded as female. In one episode, We Need to Talk, there's a moment between them that the American broadcast aired without blinking. The UK version did not. Cartoon Network UK quietly re-edited the scene to pull the romantic framing out of it, to make the moment between the two of them read as less intimate. When fans noticed, they were furious, and a petition demanding an uncut version pulled in thousands of signatures. The network's defense was that it had to make content suitable for kids of any age watching at any time of day, which sounds totally neutral, right up until you notice it's always the same kind of scene getting flagged. The American kids and the British kids watched what they thought was the same episode. One group just got a slightly edited version of who was allowed to love who. The Peppa Pig ban. We already talked about Peppa getting pulled in Australia over a spider, but there's a much bigger Peppa ban, and it has nothing to do with the content of any single episode. In China, around 2018, Peppa Pig got scrubbed from major video platforms entirely, with tens of thousands of clips wiped overnight. And the reason is one of the strangest sentences in this whole iceberg. Peppa had accidentally become a symbol of the gangster counterculture. Online, young people in China had turned the cheerful little pig into an ironic mascot for being a shihuran, a slacker, a rebel, someone who rejects mainstream rules. Peppa tattoos, Peppa gangster memes, the whole thing. To the authorities, a children's character getting adopted as a flag for anti-establishment attitude was a problem, so the cartoon pig got treated as a subversive influence and pushed off the platforms. Think about that for a second. A show for preschoolers was effectively censored by a national government, not for anything in the show, but for what a bunch of teenagers decided it secretly stood for. Level 3. Bootman. Johnny Bravo was a goofy show about a muscle-bound idiot in sunglasses, so not exactly the kind of thing you'd expect to get yanked off the air. But there's an episode from 2001 called Bootman, where Johnny gets superpowers, and at one point he picks up an airplane and hurls it into the side of a building. When the episode was made, it was just a dumb cartoon gag. Then September 11th happened, and overnight that image of a plane being thrown into a building became something no network could broadcast. According to the episode's own director, Bootman was quietly pulled from rotation for around 4 years after the attacks. Nobody had to explain why. The episode hadn't changed at all, not a single frame, but the meaning of those few seconds had been completely rewritten by an event that happened after it was finished. It eventually came back once enough time had passed, and most people who see it now have no idea it was ever gone. Mass transit trouble. Here's an older one, from a show a lot of people forgot existed, Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog. There's an episode called Mass Transit Trouble, where the villain plants bombs across a city's public transit system, and Sonic has to race around defusing them, about as standard as cartoon plots get. Then, in April 1995, a bomb destroyed a federal building in Oklahoma City, and a cartoon about bombs hidden in public places was suddenly the last thing anyone wanted on a kids' channel. The episode was pulled from the broadcast rotation, and for a while it was hard to see at all. It's the same pattern as Johnny Bravo, just earlier. It quietly disappeared for a while, and you can kind of understand why. Because nobody wanted their kid watching a cheerful cartoon about hidden bombs the same month a real one went off and took lives. The Police Competition. Bubble Guppies is a preschool show, about as low stakes as it gets. Little fish kids learning about jobs. One episode, The Police Competition, is exactly what it sounds like. A fun, upbeat look at police officers, framed for 3-year-olds as heroic and exciting. For most of the show's life, that was completely uncontroversial. Then came the summer of 2020, the protests after George Floyd, and a national conversation about policing that made a cheerful "Police are awesome" episode for toddlers feel like a landmine. Nickelodeon pulled it from rotation. It's just a small example, but it's a clean one, because nothing in the episode was ever meant to be a statement. It just suddenly was one, through no faults of its own, the second the country's mood shifted underneath it. Stark Raving Dad. This last one is technically The Simpsons, which is a family show more than a strictly kids show, but it belongs here because of how completely it got erased. In a 1991 episode called Stark Raving Dad, Homer ends up in a psychiatric facility and befriends a large man who believes he's Michael Jackson. The character was voiced, in secret at the time, by Michael Jackson himself. For decades, it was treated as a classic. Then in 2019, the documentary Leaving Neverland aired, detailing the abuse allegations that surfaced against Jackson. Shortly after, the producers of The Simpsons made a decision. The episode would be pulled from circulation entirely. It was removed from streaming, from syndication, from the box sets. The showrunner said it no longer felt right to have it out in the world. So one of the best-known episodes of the entire show just quietly came off the board. Not for anything in the writing, but because of what was later alleged about one of the voices behind it. Level 4. Do not air. You Can't Do That on Television was the messy, green slime Canadian sketch show that basically launched Nickelodeon, and it ran for years without ever pulling an episode, with a single exception in the US. That one banned episode was about adoption. The sketches treated being adopted as a punchline, with kids essentially being mocked or rejected over it. The producers looked at the finished episode and realized it could genuinely wound the exact children watching at home, the ones who were adopted and didn't need a comedy show telling them they were unwanted. So after airing only a couple of times, in an edited form, the episode was pulled for good. And the story goes that the master tape ended up labeled with a warning that it was never to air again. A show whose entire brand was that it would do anything, slime anyone, mock everything, found the one subject it decided wasn't worth a laugh. For a chaos show, that's a surprisingly human line to draw. I Lost My Mind. iCarly was one of the biggest live-action shows of its era, and for a while, one of its episodes quietly disappeared. In I Lost My Mind, the character Sam ends up in a psychiatric hospital, and the episode plays a lot of her stay for laughs, with the facility and the patients being used as a comedy backdrop. When it was aired, it was just another episode. Years later, the framing aged badly. As the conversation around mental health shifted, an episode that used a psych ward as a punchline started to look less harmless, and it was pulled from rotation and streaming around 2021. There was no big announcement, it just quietly stopped showing up. And it's a strange thing to revisit, because the show didn't change, the culture did. And a storyline that once read as standard sitcom hijinks now reads as the kind of thing a network would rather you didn't rewatch. The Yellow Ranger. This one isn't a banned episode. It's the saddest entry on this level, and it belongs here because of what the show chose to do. If you were a kid in the 90s like me, you knew the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And you knew Trini, the Yellow Ranger, the first one. She was played by an actress named Toi Trang, who'd come to America as a refugee from Vietnam and become one of the very few Asian American leads a whole generation of kids grew up watching every single day. In September of 2001, Toi Trang died in a car accident on a California highway. She was 27 years old. The Power Rangers franchise was years past her time on the show by then, but it didn't let the moment pass unmarked. An episode of the season airing at the time, Power Rangers Time Force, was dedicated to her memory. There's no scandal here, no censored frame, nothing pulled. Just a young woman a lot of people grew up idolizing, gone far too soon, and a kids show quietly stopping for a second to say her name. Sometimes the heaviest thing in the vault isn't a hidden episode at all. It's the real life behind the costume. Level 5. Hot Spells. Darkwing Duck was a Disney afternoon staple, a comedic superhero duck. Not where you'd expect to find hell. But there's an episode called Hot Spells, where Darkwing's daughter gets her hands on a spellbook, and the plot sends Darkwing into a deal with a literal devil figure, named Beelzebub, complete with an underworld and a battle for a soul. This was right in the thick of what people now call the Satanic Panic, when religious groups were scanning children's media for occult content. Disney apparently got nervous fast. By most accounts, the episode aired and then was pulled almost immediately, within a day, and kept out of rotation for a long time afterward. A comedy duck show had wandered into demons and damnation, and a company that lives and dies on its wholesome image wanted no part of that fight. Did the episode actually corrupt anyone, or did a panicked era just need something to point at? You can probably guess where I land, but the ban was real either way. Hef in a Handbasket. Rocco's Modern Life was always sneaking adult jokes past the censors, but one segment crossed into territory Nickelodeon didn't want. In Hef in a Handbasket, Rocco's best friend Heifer ends up in the afterlife, in a place the show frames as a cartoon version of hell, ruled by a devil character, with the number of the beast turning up as a gag. For a kids' network during the Satanic Panic years, demons and 666 jokes were exactly the kind of things that generated angry phone calls. So the segment got flagged and pulled from rotation, the same way a handful of Rocco bits did over the years for sailing too close to the edge. I'll be straight with you, the paper trail on this one is thinner than the others, mostly community records rather than a big network statement, so take the exact details with a little caution. But the broader pattern is rock solid. There was a window in the 90s where a cartoon so much as winking at hell was enough to get an episode quietly binged. See Me, Feel Me, Know Me. The Powerpuff Girls had an episode that, in the United States, basically does not exist. See Me, Feel Me, Know Me was banned by Cartoon Network in the US, and the only places it ever aired were Canada and the UK. According to the show's creator, the problem was the imagery. The episode features a hippie-like gnome figure, who some viewers read as a stand-in for Jesus, and a scene where falling debris forms shapes that look an awful lot like crosses. Religious imagery in a superhero cartoon for little kids was a headache the network just didn't want. So it pulled the episode from American airwaves entirely, and later it kept off the streaming rotation too, while Canadian kids got to see the whole thing. So there's a whole Powerpuff Girls episode that aired to kids abroad and basically nowhere in the country that made it. You can find it now on home media, and it's genuinely strange to sit there watching something this ordinary and realize it got blacklisted at home over a few crosses and a guy who looked a little bit like Jesus. The Sailor Moon edits. Sailor Moon is one of the most beloved magical girl shows ever made, and depending on where you lived, you saw a very different version of it. In Saudi Arabia, the show was banned outright, with officials objecting to its themes, and in various Western dubs, religious imagery got quietly scrubbed. A sacred object called the Holy Grail in the original was renamed to avoid the reference, and in one storyline, an image of a character posed like a figure on a cross was edited out, because that crucifixion reference was a line the localizers wouldn't cross. The wild thing about Sailor Moon is that it wasn't one ban, it was a whole patchwork. Different countries cut different things for different reasons, so there's no single real version that everyone watched. Your Sailor Moon and someone else's Sailor Moon in another country might genuinely be two different shows, and almost none of the kids watching had any idea that what reached their screen had already been quietly rewritten for them. Level 6. 3.5 million tapes. In 1999, Disney did something it had basically never done. It recalled one of its own movies. The film was The Rescuers, an animated classic from 1977 that had already been sold on home video to families all over the world. And then someone, freeze-framing the tape, noticed something in the background of a scene. In two separate frames, tucked into a window as the characters fly through the city, there's a photograph of a partially nude woman. It's there for a fraction of a second, completely invisible at normal speed, the kind of thing only the VCR generation could ever have found by pausing frame by frame. But once it was out, Disney moved fast and hard. The company recalled around 3.5 million copies of the videotape. Reports at the time suggested the image had been slipped in during production, decades earlier, and sat there undetected through an entire theatrical run and years of home video. A beloved kids movie had been hiding something in plain sight the whole time, and it took a generation of people with pause buttons to catch it. Man's Best Friend. Ren and Stimpy was already the most unhinged thing on Nickelodeon, but there is one episode the network refused to air at all. It's called Man's Best Friend, and in it, a recurring character named George Liquor adopts Ren and Stimpy. And at one point, Ren snaps and attacks George with a boat oar in a scene far too violent for a kid's cartoon. Nickelodeon took one look and said no. The episode being rejected became the final straw in a bigger fight. The show's creator, John Kricfalusi, was pushing the content further than the network would allow, and not long after, he was removed from his own show. Man's Best Friend sat on a shelf unaired for over a decade, until it finally premiered in 2003 on a different channel aimed at adults. So an episode too violent for kids in 1992 became a kind of relic, the thing that helped get a creator fired off the cartoon he built. The version of Ren and Stimpy people remember was shaped partly by the episode they never got to see. Buffalo Gals. Cartoon Network had an episode of Cow and Chicken called Buffalo Gals, and it aired exactly one time, on June 27, 1998, before it got yanked for good. The plot has a biker gang of tough women who break into Cow and Chicken's house, and the whole thing is built on a wink-wink running gag. They're called the Buffalo Gals. They're written as a crude caricature of tough, masculine women, and the whole thing runs on a string of not-so-subtle adult innuendo. The story that's always told is that a single parent complaint was enough to make the network pull it. Whether it was literally one letter or not, the effect was real. The episode was permanently replaced in every rerun with a different one, and it's stayed off official streaming ever since. It's a strange little time capsule, the kind of innuendo that slipped past a network's standards department in the 90s and would not survive a single morning today. Demi Lovato steps in. In 2011, the Disney Channel had 2 shows pull jokes within days of each other, and the person who forced it was one of their own former stars. There was a gag in an episode of Shake It Up, and another in a sketch show called So Random that made light of an eating disorder. Demi Lovato, who had recently left a Disney show to get treatment for an eating disorder of her own, saw it and publicly tore into the network for joking about the exact illness she was fighting. Disney pulled the material quickly, and what makes this one land, especially for anyone who grew up on these shows, is that it wasn't some outside watchdog or angry parent group. It was a young woman who had been inside that machine, who knew exactly how many kids were watching and how an offhand joke about it could sound to a teenager already struggling. The episodes got quietly edited, and the network got a very public reminder that the audience it was making jokes about was the same audience it was supposed to be protecting. Katy Perry and Elmo. Here's a lighter one to catch your breath before the bottom. In 2010, Sesame Street filmed a musical segment with Katy Perry singing a kid-friendly version of one of her songs with Elmo, which sounds completely harmless. The problem, according to the complaints that rolled in once a preview went online, was the dress. Some parents felt Perry's outfit showed too much for a preschool audience, and the reaction online got loud enough that Sesame Street made a call before it ever aired on TV. The segment was scrapped from broadcast. It still lives online, because nothing ever really disappears once it's been posted, but it never ran in the actual show. It's a small one, and honestly kind of funny compared to everything around it, but it fits the pattern of this level perfectly. Something nobody thought twice about while filming that became a problem the second the public got a freeze frame and an opinion. Level 7. Goodbye, Mr. Hooper. For years on Sesame Street, one of the kindest faces on the show belonged to Mr. Hooper, the old man who ran the store, played by an actor named Will Lee. In late 1982, Will Lee passed away, and the people who made Sesame Street faced a decision most kids' shows would have dodged. They could quietly recast him, or send Mr. Hooper off on a trip, and never mention it. Instead, they decided to tell the children the truth. They wrote an episode where Big Bird learns that Mr. Hooper has died, and that he isn't coming back, and that there's no fixing it or undoing it. The adults explain death to Big Bird in the simplest, most honest words they can find, and you can see the real grief on the cast's faces, because they were mourning their actual friend. The episode was deliberately scheduled to air on Thanksgiving in 1983, so that families would be together when it did. It's not really a banned episode, it's something much rarer than that. A children's show that chose to walk straight into the hardest conversation there is, instead of pretending it wasn't happening. And it's still remembered as one of the bravest things a kids program has ever done. The Other Goodbye. Now here's the one almost nobody knows, and it's the darker mirror of the story we just told. On that same Sesame Street, in that same store, there was another longtime cast member, an actor named Northern Calloway, who played a character called David for nearly 20 years. Kids watched David grow up on that show, work the counter at Hooper's store, become part of the family, and then, quietly after 1989, David was simply gone, with no farewell episode and no explanation. The role just retired and never spoken of again. What the children watching were never told is that Northern Calloway had been struggling badly near the end, with serious mental health and behavioral problems, and that in early 1990, he died at the age of 41 in a psychiatric hospital. His passing was barely public at the time. Where Will Lee's death got an honest, careful goodbye, David's got silence, the role written out with no acknowledgement at all. Two men worked that same counter on that same show, and it handled their deaths in completely opposite ways. It built a landmark around one of them, and buried the other in silence. And most of the kids who loved David never learned what really happened to him. The man who played Buckwheat. Billy Thomas was a child star. He played Buckwheat in the old Our Gang shorts, what later generations knew as the Little Rascals, one of the most recognizable child performers of his era. He grew up, left Hollywood, lived a normal working life, and in 1980 he died of a heart attack at 49. That should have been where the story ended, but it wasn't. A decade later, in 1990, the ABC News program 2020 ran a segment claiming to have found the real adult Buckwheat working as a grocery bagger. Millions of people watched it. There was just one problem. It was completely false. The man they featured was not Billy Thomas, who had been dead for 10 years. A former child co-star, Spanky, publicly exposed the whole thing as a hoax. The producer behind the segment resigned, and Billy Thomas's own son sued the network for dragging his late father's name and image into a fabricated story. So a man who'd already passed away was, years later, impersonated on national television, his identity handed to a stranger by a news show that didn't check. It's one of the strangest, most disrespectful things a major network ever did to a former kid star, and it happened long after he was gone. The show that was erased will end at the most complete disappearance on this whole list. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there was an animated preschool show called Little Bill, about a sweet little boy and his family made for the youngest kids. It taught kindness and patience, it won awards, and it was a fixture of the Nick Jr. morning block. Today, you basically can't find it anywhere. It's gone from streaming, gone from rerun schedules, effectively wiped from existence. The reason is the man whose name was attached to it. Little Bill was created by and built around Bill Cosby, who, in the years after the show, faced allegations of sexual assault from dozens of women. As those allegations came to light, networks quietly pulled his work, and a gentle little cartoon for 3-year-olds got swept up in it and erased along with everything else connected to him. There's something genuinely sad about it, because the people who made that show, the animators, the other voices, the writers, made something good. But when a show is built entirely around one person, it can't really outlive what that person turns out to have done. And Little Bill is what it looks like when a whole piece of childhood gets quietly deleted. Not for anything it ever said, but for who was standing behind it. So that's the Iceberg. From a flashing cartoon that put nearly 700 kids in the hospital, all the way down to a whole show erased because of the man behind it. And the strangest part is how little of it was ever really about the episodes themselves. Most of these got buried because the world around them changed, or because of something real and human happening just off camera, in the lives of the people who made them. If there's a banned or pulled episode from your own childhood I didn't cover, drop it in the comments. I read them, and the deep cuts you all know are always the best part. And if you made it all the way down here with me, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.